Robby, what's on your radar?
Well, last week, CNN's Jake Tapper asked a provocative question. Let's watch.
I have to say, I'm surprised that there hasn't been a national conversation about the damage done to kids because of these school closures and the virtual learning and everything. Because, I mean, I'm not saying there should be a national do-over, but we can't just pretend that fifth graders who are now seventh graders, that didn't happen. You know, like, I feel like there should be, and not with a blame game. Look, it happened. People did it. It was criticized, the school closures, the virtual learning, et cetera. But here we are. There needs to be like a bipartisan movement, you know?
To repeat, Tapper's question was this. I'm surprised that there hasn't been a national conversation about the damage done to kids because of these school closures. Well, the Associated Press asked a similar question in a recent article that considered the regrets of some parents, health officials, and politicians who had all previously supported closing schools due to COVID-19. One profiled parent, a woman named Vivian, said she was in favor of keeping schools closed, but then her school-aged daughter became depressed and started failing all of her virtual classes. It didn't work at all, says Vivian. Knowing what I know now, I would say they should have put them in school. A Chicago parent, Marla, also thought schools needed to be shut down to protect the community and expected virtual learning would work okay. Her own teenager quickly became unmotivated and stopped doing his assignments until he could go back to actual classes. These comments echo the sentiments of Leanna Wen, a professor of public health and national commentator whose COVID views were once so pro-lockdown, she flirted with suggesting the unvaccinated should be forced to remain in their homes. But after she saw firsthand how school shutdowns had affected her own young kids, she changed her tune, advocating a broad return to normal in the winter and spring of 2022. That earned her charges of ableism from former progressive allies. But the damage to kids, not from the virus itself, but from our response to the virus, is not merely anecdotal. We can see it in the data. According to a study by Emily Oster of Brown University, pandemic-era schooling was associated with a 12.8% decrease in math scores for kids in grades 3 through 8, and a 6.8% decline in reading scores. Quote, the declines were larger in districts that had less in-person schooling and in districts with more black students, writes Oster. These results also may provide a note of caution when considering school closures in the future. You think? But I want to point something out. Oster was able to make those comparisons specifically because it's not true that all schools shut down for the pandemic. This may come as a surprise to media progressives who dutifully follow every dictate coming from the White House and the CDC, but red states simply didn't follow nearly the same path as their liberal counterparts. Here's a map of the 50 states showing the percentage of students who dealt with virtual learning for the 2020 to 2021 school year. The pinker the color, the more in-person schooling, the darker red pink. So you can see from this map significant variation. California kids spending 71% of the year in virtual school, while Florida students, for instance, spent only 3% of the year in virtual school. But there's also tremendous variation within schools. Indeed, there are many states where public schools were significantly shut down while their counterparts in the private sector were not. Many private and religious schools knew that the best way to serve their communities, to serve children and their families, was to reopen and was to stay open. But public schools had a powerful advocacy group, teachers' unions, that pressured politicians to keep schools closed long past the point at which any logical argument could be mustered for doing so. Indeed, public schools remained the most locked-down sector of our society. In the nation's capital, where I live, public schools were closed even as indoor restaurants were open for business. So let's return to Jake Tapper's question. I'm surprised that there hasn't been a national conversation about the damage done to kids because of these school closures. Well, actually, there has been a national conversation. It was taking place all along. It just took place largely outside the mainstream media, apparently without the mainstream media's permission or awareness. And in the course of that conversation, many families, their schools, and their political representatives decided that the cost of closing down schools definitely would be too great, so they didn't do it. And there's actually, so I wrote this radar botcha just like on Saturday, and then new data came out yesterday that confirms, just offers more data to confirm what we're talking about. Some of it also from Professor Emily Oster, who's a really great resource on this. The new, so from the NAEP, that's the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and according to this data, states with more in-person schooling, they staved off math loss considerably better than states where there was virtual learning. And also it reveals that Catholic schools did not suffer learning losses the way public schools did, because a lot of them were open pretty dramatically. I have nieces and nephews in Catholic school in Michigan, and except for the initial shutdown, in the spring, in March, April of 2020. Other than that, they were in school basically the entire time. They went back in the fall, whereas a lot of others did not. That was true of schools in Virginia. Many Catholic schools, K through 12, were open, and so there was a different way to do it. So it's fascinating to see people in the media, and I like Jake Tapper. I think he is one of the few voices in the mainstream media who actually does have some awareness of what people outside his bubble think and discuss and are saying. But broadly speaking, the mainstream media is now acting like, wow, I think they're admitting that this was a mistake. And they're like, wow, if only someone had thought that this was going to be a mistake. Like, so many people said that all the way along, and in fact made other choices months earlier than they did.
Right. It was funny when Jake Tapper was like, there should be a bipartisan commission. It's like, no. Only one side did this, so only one side needs to investigate this, right? I do think there's an irony to the fact that in the South, Black kids of color, ended up doing better in school and sustaining less of an increasing gap between them and their white counterparts than all of the places where progressives claim to care so much about minority communities, right? I mean, at what point do we start to say, no, you did this? You have lost the right to say we care about those children because you forced them to stay home, where they were getting abused more, where they didn't have enough to eat, where they were learning nothing while your kids were in private school, right? I mean, at what point do we say that this has been a failure, this approach? Not just, and it's not just COVID. COVID is one of many, right? The whole equity approach to saying, instead of talking about the fact that we're not teaching these children to read and we're not teaching them to do math, we're going to take away AP classes so that gap between them and our kids is less apparent, right? The hiding of the gap rather than talking about it to try to resolve it. I think this is just one more example of that.
And of course, all the related things that that get taken away when you have virtual schooling or no schooling at all. You lose extracurriculars, you lose sports, you lose socialization for young people. I mean, school is that from in K through 12, school is your life. I mean, that's true of virtually all kids. That's how they see their friends. That's how they learn how to interact, with other human beings. And so much of the antisocial behavior that we're seeing, or the rise in antisocial behavior, I have to think has something to do with interrupting the normal process of adolescent development that takes place in school, and then also the disruption to parents, to working people who need to have someone watch their kids. On some level, at its most basic, even putting aside the reading and math scores, school for young kids at least is serving a basic daycare function that was just totally unavailable to some of the people who need it most for like a year and a half, which is crazy that we let it go on that long. I remember thinking the very beginning, I sounded the other note. I'm like, well, okay, a couple weeks off from school, there's kids are resilient. Some of that loss occurs during every summer break. It gets made up. It's not going to be the end of the world. It's fine. I had no idea. I truly did not believe that any serious education official would allow school to not resume in the fall. I thought, well, that'd be crazy. Obviously, we won't do that. And then they did it in city after city, in state after state. And now we're going to suffer the consequences of that for quite a while, sadly.
Yeah.
All right, we'll have more Rising right after this. Stay with us.